having an undergraduate program offer a conference like this is unusual and special. And here we have something that's it's professional, there are panels, there are moderators. It's very well done, and it's an important learning experience that we're offering that schools typically don't do, much larger schools don't do. So I just want to emphasize that this is something special that we've done, and we've done it for over a decade now, and I'm just really happy that we're able to offer this experience. And of course, this year is even more significant than usual in the sense that we had gone for 11 years straight, and then owing to the pandemic, we took a little break. So this is the first pandemic-era live conference that we're doing after a 2-year break. So the people presenting today, it's kind of a rebirth going on here and a re-emergence of the conference, and I think that makes this all the more significant that we're doing that. I also wanted to just welcome everyone who's here. Right? We have mentioned that the Chancellor Elsenbaumer is here, and we thank him for coming. He came to our last conference also, and we really appreciate his support for this event and for this, specials coming out on a Saturday. I also want to thank all the students who showed up, and their family members, and their friends, and community members. And I want to thank the faculty and staff at the university, right? And I see faculty and staff not just from the history department, but from other departments too. So, we thank all of you for coming out and supporting this event. And this event wouldn't be possible if we didn't have a lot of people working behind the scenes to make it happen. And first and foremost, we have Dr. Lifshitz, who had the great idea for this event over a decade ago and has been the driving force behind it ever since. And thanks to her for organizing the event for today. And one thing to add to that is that, if we think, if I'm right that this is number 12, we've had countless students present papers and get practice in public presentation. We've also had those students get to put that on their resume. And we've also had faculty who attended the events get to write about that if they have to write them professional letters. So it's, the event has significance beyond the experience of today. So I want to thank Dr. Lifshitz for all her fantastic work on this. I also want to thank our office manager, Terry Luce, to dealing with some of the organization, the purchase of things that were necessary for the event, all the food, our new logo notepads. And while that might sound pretty easy, dealing with bureaucracy at the university makes these things challenging. And so she dealt with all that in an effective way and helped with the setup. Professor Bauer helped with the issues of recruitment and organizing panels and put the information on social media. Professor Hakes, who was one of our former students who went on to get an advanced degree and has returned here, helped with setup and also recruiting students. Professor Schuster helped with recruiting students. Professor Melanson did a prep session for the student presenters. And I want to thank all of them. And I especially want to thank the students who were presenting, right? I know that you had to initially write the paper in a class. You had to then figure out how to condense it for presentation here. And also, I mean, it takes courage to put your ideas out there, be in front of a group, and we thank you for all your efforts in having the courage to come and do this. And maybe it's an example to some other students who are here in the audience that maybe you'll want to follow that example and present next year. Turning to the event that we have in front of us for today, we have 3 really interesting panels that I think you're really going to enjoy. Each panel has 3 papers. There's one panel that is on the CIA and the Cold War, another on the Holocaust, and a final one on media and fiction and discourse in the 20th century. I want to draw your attention to the fact that in addition to the presentations, there's a question and answer period. And I encourage people to ask questions. I mean, these conferences are more intellectually rich if there's an exchange of ideas. So don't hesitate if you have a question. And it could have an added benefit. A question might provide food for thought for the presenter. With all that, I welcome everybody to the conference, and I can, I guess, turn it over to Deborah Bauer, who is moderator of the first panel.
Well, first of all, thank you, Dr. Weiner, for that nice introduction. Thank you, Dr. Lipschitz, for organizing this panel. Thank you, audience, for coming to join us. And thank you especially to these 3 panelists for being the ones to start off our very first panel of the first conference we've had in 2 years. So that's really great. Obviously, this subject is near and dear to my heart. I had these students in a class I taught last fall called The History of Espionage. And while I offered them the framework in thinking of espionage and intelligence in history, the topics that they presented on are topics that they chose themselves and are really neat topics, really interesting. And I will say they were 3 of the best papers that I read, not only in that class, but honestly in my, I don't know, we're not counting years, however many years I've been here teaching. So without further ado, I would like to invite our very first speaker of the day, who is Logan Cox. And I don't have my panel in front of me, so that's the name of your paper. That's my bad. Logan's paper is called Impacts of the 1953 Coup in Iran on the Operational Culture of the Early CIA.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. The world found itself faced with great change and uncertainty in the 1950s. The Cold War was just beginning, and the United States needed new ways to combat the Soviet Union and to contain the spread of communism. The newly created Central Intelligence Agency found itself at the center of this effort to combat communism. And as the agency was only a few years old at this time, most of its operational procedures were still in their infancy. In 1953, the CIA would make its first attempt at regime change in Iran. Motivated by fears of a future collapse of the Iranian economy, opening the way for a communist takeover, the CIA initiated Operation TP Ajax to overthrow Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh. The propaganda and espionage techniques developed during this coup would influence early attempts at covert action by the CIA. The success of TP Ajax provided the CIA a model in which they based future coups, and it reinforced a reckless operational culture in the early agency that was exposed by the failure of the Bay of Pigs invasion. The series of events that would lead to the overthrow of the Iranian government began in 1951 when Prime Minister Mossadegh nationalized the country's oil industry, which was primarily controlled by the British Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. This made Mossadegh very popular in Iran, but it was a problem for Britain, who wanted to retain control of the global oil market. The United States wanted to keep the global oil market in the hands of Western powers as well, but their motivation for the coup was slightly different. According to a November 1952 National Intelligence estimate, there was concern that an economic downturn due to nationalization of the oil industry may increase internal tensions that could result in a breakdown of the government. In the event of such a possible breakdown, the U.S. feared that communism may take hold in Iran, taking with it strategically important oil reserves. As such, the coup in Iran was less about preventing a communist government from taking over, but preventing the conditions which may give rise to one. The coup, known as TP Ajax, began planning in April 1953. It relied on a massive propaganda campaign by a concurrent operation known as TP Bidam. This propaganda undermined Mossadegh's government, vilified communism, and praised Western-style governance. This was done by distributing news articles and political cartoons, recruiting a network of agents that could be used in special operations, inciting violence to undermine the government's ability to keep the peace, and bribing government officials to cripple Mossadegh's ability to mobilize support. TP Ajax first launched on August 15th of 1953, but Mossadegh had been tipped off about the coup and quickly put it down. Despite this seeming failure, TP Ajax leader Kermit Roosevelt tried to salvage the operation against the advice of the CIA. Using agents recruited by TP Bidam, decrees from the Iranian monarch dismissing Mossadegh and installing a general to rule were distributed, and anti-Mossadegh demonstrations were organized. On August 19th, a second attempt commenced, and this would succeed and install a pro-Western monarch that ruled the country until the 1970s. With this success, regime change had been cemented as a critical part of U.S. Cold War espionage. Regime change was a relatively inexpensive way to secure U.S. foreign interests that also avoided the possibility of large-scale military confrontation. Future coup attempts would reflect both the good and the bad of this first attempt in Iran. Propaganda campaigns to undermine the ruling government became key parts of successful coups in the future. Members of the government or the military would be divided against the country's leader, and anti-communism would be a driving factor behind many future coups. The improvised nature of the successful coup in Iran would also reinforce a reckless operational culture in the agency that would manifest as ill-advised decisions and overconfidence in coups following Iran. To evaluate the validity of these claims, several actions after 1953 need to be examined. In 1954, Guatemala became the next target of a CIA coup. The country's leader was Jacobo Arbenz, who was a communist, or at least a communist sympathizer, and the country's land reform efforts were seen by the United States as a vehicle to spread communist influence. Like with Iran, the CIA feared that Guatemala may become a communist stronghold, and so plans were made to oust Arbenz. Interestingly, no options except for a coup seem to have been considered. As historian Piero Gliese commented, given the imbalance of power between the United States and Guatemala, the cost of destroying the Arbenz government was so low that the Americans did not bother to contemplate any alternative. This is an early sign of possible overconfidence in the CIA's own abilities. In June 1954, 250 Guatemalan exiles landed in the country and moved to take it over. Under threat of U.S. military intervention, broadcast by a CIA-operated radio station, nobody opposed the exiles. Like in Iran, the CIA propaganda targeted all sections of Guatemalan society in an effort to undermine Arbenz's legitimacy. This propaganda pushed the idea that Arbenz's government had been infiltrated and was being secretly controlled by communists. These efforts would end up turning the Guatemalan army against Arbenz and successfully oust him. Key elements of the coup in Iran can be seen repeated in Guatemala. Extensive propaganda efforts were utilized both times, and dividing the military against the country's leader was a key part of both attempts. Anti-communist mentality also played a key role in both coups. Elements of recklessness are also clearly visible in Guatemala. In addition to the lack of consideration of options besides a coup, the CIA neglected to embed any agents in Guatemala until late in the operation, which hindered their ability to assess the mood of the Guatemalan people and institutions. Additionally, there was no real way to predict or guide events in the country until just about a month before the coup launched. Finally, the CIA made no actual plans for what would happen when the replacement leader took power. This behavior is indicative of an amateur CIA operating with a great degree of recklessness, and this operational culture likely results from the success of the improvised coup in Iran, reinforcing that the CIA could behave recklessly and still succeed. While Guatemala was a success, Fidel Castro would soon take power in Cuba, and this time the CIA would fail. Fidel Castro took power in Cuba in 1959 and created a communist nation right on America's doorstep. President Eisenhower would quickly draft plans to remove Castro from power, but these would not be acted on until 1961 under President Kennedy. The CIA planned to train Cuban exiles to invade the country, expecting that popular support for Castro would crumble when the country faced the shock of an invasion. Instead, Cuban forces were ready to counter the exiles, who landed in the country completely unsupported. The Bay of Pigs invasion was a spectacular failure and a major embarrassment for President Kennedy. It also exposed the reckless operational culture that had developed in the wake of the coup in Iran. This reckless operational culture would inspire such overconfidence that the CIA misled the president about the nature of the operation he was authorizing. The Bay of Pigs invasion plan had two tracks. Track 1 assumed that Castro's regime would fall when the exiles established a beachhead, and this was agreed on by both the CIA and Kennedy. However, Track 2 meant different things to each party. To Kennedy, Track 2 meant that the Cuban exiles would escape into the countryside and become guerrilla fighters if the Cuban government did not collapse. CIA officials assured the Kennedy administration that this was their plan as well, and while they did assume that the exiles would take up guerrilla fighting, they also assumed that Kennedy would use military force rather than let the exiles be defeated. For the CIA, Track 2 meant a military invasion, and they hoped that a beachhead could be held long enough for Kennedy to be forced to authorize military action, lest he be seen as weak on communism. Despite clear indications that Kennedy would not authorize military intervention, the CIA went ahead with the invasion anyway. The CIA also massively underestimated Castro and the Cuban people. They failed to assess both the attitude of the Cuban people towards Castro and to build any sort of resistance against him. Their plan seemed to rely entirely on the assumption that Cuba would collapse when hit with the shock of invasion. Finally, the CIA seemed to have no plans for what to do if the Bay of Pigs invasion failed. In Guatemala, the CIA did not expect that the rebels would defeat the government until the army turned against Arbenz, and this taught the agency that coups were too chaotic for concrete planning. Based on this, the CIA seems to have concluded that planning for anything beyond landing the exiles was either infeasible or impossible. No efforts to divide the Cuban military against Castro were made either, which only made the vague and haphazard plans for the invasion worse. These events display the recklessness instilled by the successes in Iran and Guatemala, finally causing catastrophe. The CIA neglected large-scale propaganda efforts, failed to assess the attitude of Cubans, and failed to divide the people and the army against Castro. Their recklessness and overconfidence caused the CIA to neglect to make any plans for failure, and to mislead the president as to what exactly he was authorizing. This reckless operational culture was possibly the result of the success of the improvised coup in Iran and the successes in both Iran and Guatemala, building the CIA's confidence until it would finally backfire on them in Cuba. The 1953 coup in Iran would define the operational culture of the CIA. It created a model for future coups, one which relied on propaganda campaigns, division of the nation against the leader, and some degree of anti-communist considerations. It also instilled cognitive barriers and tendencies towards failure that manifested as overconfidence and a reckless operational culture. In both detrimental and advantageous ways, the 1953 coup in Iran defined the operations of the early CIA. Thank you.
Thank you, Logan. Well, building on the operational culture of the CIA, we've got another paper talking about CIA decision-making, and our next presenter up will be Stephen Dellinger, whose paper is called Human Error in Intelligence Interpretation in the Cuban Missile Crisis.
For 30 years after the Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962, the same story was told over and over of a cool-headed and confident young leader, President John F. Kennedy, navigating the minefield of Cold War politics while resisting the aggressive Soviet Union and rebuking the war hawks of his own administration. As the legend goes, only the temperament of Kennedy and a select few advisors, including his brother Robert, prevented nuclear Armageddon. This was the story Robert Kennedy and other members of the administration told for as long as anyone would believe it, and the one that remains in the popular imagination. However, with the fall of the Soviet Union, scholars began to challenge this understanding of events. For a brief window, Russia opened up to the historical community, and historians began to dismiss the romantic vision of a brave young president single-handedly disarming the crisis. As both the Russian perspective and previously classified American documents have become available to researchers, analyses of the Kennedy administration's actions have received more scrutiny. As former Soviet and other non-Western sources continue to be utilized, the old question of how the world leaders avoid nuclear war has become less relevant than how the Cuban Missile Crisis came to be in the first place. While the basic facts of the discovery of Soviet missiles in Cuba are well known, the role of culture and ideological bias in creating the human errors that destroyed incoming intelligence is less studied. On the United States' side, strident anti-communism gave American leadership an almost caricature-like view of Soviet government. To Westernize, the Soviet Union was the evil empire, spreading its ideology by force. This view fit the Eurocentric and America-centric outlook, where non-Western powers, other than the Soviets, were irrelevant compared to the superpowers. The Soviets, meanwhile, saw themselves as an equal to the United States, and expected a certain sort of respect as one of the two regimes responsible for maintaining the Cold War world order. Any encroachment was assumed to be a prelude to a counter-revolutionary attack. Both the United States and Soviet Union's perspectives failed to account for the others, and set into motion the series of miscalculations and misunderstandings that would ultimately take the world the closest it's ever been to the brink of annihilation. The United States viewed the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Cold War itself as a standoff between the two great powers. Other players, including Cuba, were considered so minor by the Americans that they failed to conceive of them as independent actors. When former Kennedy administration officials recounted the events of October 1962, they framed it as a duel between the Soviet Union and the United States. McGeorge Bundy, the U.S. Special Assistant for National Security Affairs, once said, "The conduct of both sides at the height of the crisis, especially of the two leaders, was marked by prudence and skill." While it's possible that the former officials only pushed this narrative to portray themselves in a positive light, it is more likely that this was their actual thinking. They did not simply ignore the Cubans' role after the fact, but failed to take notice of their influence during the Cuban Missile Crisis. When Robert Kennedy penned his memoir, 13 Days, he called the crisis a confrontation between the two giant atomic nations, the U.S. and USSR, which brought the world to the abyss of nuclear destruction and the end of mankind. Historiographers working from a post-colonial framework have challenged such notions. As Mark Laffey and Judah Wells write in Decolonizing the Cuban Missile Crisis, America has always treated Cuba as a secondary power, without any real agency of its own. When the country was dominated by American interests, it was regarded as a client state. After the Cuban Revolution, it was seen not as a rogue nation, but an intrusion of Soviet despotism into the Western Hemisphere. Only a few advisors, such as Ambassador to the United Nations Adlai Stevenson and some mid-level State Department officials, took a more moderate stance. These liberal Democrats thought intervention would provoke resentment in former colonial nations, and that the best way forward was diplomacy and economic development in non-aligned countries. While the United States believed that it posed a greater threat than the Soviets would be willing to risk over Cuba, policymakers in the Kremlin were making different calculations. Recent years had seen the beginning of what would eventually become the Sino-Soviet Split. Upon Khrushchev's ascension, he unveiled a series of reforms to both domestic and foreign policy. The Chinese saw these changes, particularly the doctrine of peaceful coexistence with non-communists, as not just ideological heresy, but as a personal affront to the memory of Vladimir Lenin. Fidel Castro began to distance himself from Khrushchev at this time. The Cuban leader even canceled a diplomatic visit by his brother Raoul to the Soviet Union. The Kremlin panicked, and the KGB was ordered to arrange for an accidental run-in between Raoul and a Soviet diplomat, as a sort of back-channel temperature reading on Fidel's current outlook. Raoul confided to Nikolai Leonov, the agent sent by Moscow and an old friend, that the Cubans were feeling insecure as they were planning for the nationalization of American oil assets and feared retaliation. Raoul told Leonov that he believed that should the United States attempt to intervene, no other Latin American nation would risk angering the Americans by siding with Cuba. On June 16, 1960, Khrushchev received an intercepted communique between the CIA's NATO liaison and other members of the American government. The liaison mentioned that the Pentagon believed there was a favorable imbalance in nuclear firepower between the United States and Soviet Union. Military leaders believed that the Soviet Union could not currently strike all strategically important NATO targets, and that the only safe course of action was to trigger a war as soon as possible to put down any future threat. While the KGB attempted to verify the report, Khrushchev and other Soviet leaders treated the war as a live possibility. At this point, Khrushchev was faced with three main challenges: continued aloofness from factions within the Cuban government, Beijing's de facto challenge for leadership of the communist world, and impending threat of war with NATO. While the Castro regime had mostly reconciled to the Soviet Union after public statements from Khrushchev warned the United States not to intervene in their affairs, there were still anti-Moscow sentiments among hardline revolutionaries such as Che Guevara. China had already swayed the Communist parties of many other countries to the point of public condemnation of Khrushchev at a meeting of the World Federation of Trade Unions by making the Soviets appear compromising. With this in mind, the placement of nuclear weapons is in some way a rather clever way to cement the Soviet Union's place as leader of the communist world. The placement of such a great threat right under the United States' nose, on paper at least, should be able to address all three sides of the Kremlin's control problem. The deployment of such weapon systems to defend Cuba would win over hardliners in the Castro regime. By showing strength against the United States in its own backyard, the claims by the Chinese that Khrushchev was a revisionist appeasing the West would ring hollow and discredit Beijing. If the reports that the KGB delivered to Moscow were correct, then the United States was only contemplating provoking war because it believed the balance of power was in the West's favor. If the Soviet Union could shift the balance of power, the Americans would not attack. The subtleties of communist bloc internal disputes were lost on American analysts. National Security Report NSC 68, though from around a decade before the events of the Cuban Missile Crisis, serves as an excellent summary of the United States' understanding of Soviet goals and tactics. The report begins with a summary of the fundamental purpose of the United States. This section quotes the preamble of the United States to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, and provide the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. This idealistic portrayal of the United States is immediately juxtaposed with a biting summary of the fundamental designs of the Kremlin, which, according to the report, is to retain and solidify their absolute power, first in the Soviet Union, and second in the areas now under their control. In this classified internal document, where the National Security Council presumably had an interest in presenting analysis without any spin to American leadership, the writers were able to say within 2 pages, without any sense of contradiction, that in relations between nations, the prime reliance of the free society is on the strength and appeal of its idea, and it feels no compulsion sooner or later to bring all societies into conformity with it. But they also say that, beyond thus affirming our values, our policy and actions must be, as such, to foster a fundamental change in the nature of the Soviet system. In 1989, Robert McNamara said that after studying the events of October 1962, he was convinced that it was covert actions by American intelligence that had falsely signaled to Cuba and the Kremlin that American invasion was imminent. This rational fear was one of, if not the immediate cause of Khrushchev's decision to take the unprecedented step of placing nuclear weapons in Cuba. This conclusion coincided with a growing movement among historical circles that came to believe that Khrushchev's actions really were a reaction to perceived threat from a hostile foreign power towards an ally. Throughout the confusion of the Cuban Missile Crisis, one of the few constants was the American government not negotiating with Cuba or treating it as an independent actor. Any resolution had to be found by the United States and the Soviet Union. It was not until after the Cuban Missile Crisis had been resolved that the American conception of Cuba as a mere satellite of the Soviet Union began to waver. National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy was the first significant American official to show signs of treating the Cubans as independent actors. He advised Kennedy, "We should intensify our investigation of ways and means of communicating with possibly dissident members of the Castro regime, perhaps even including Fidel himself." He envisioned a Castro regime that exists as a non-aligned power akin to Josip Tito's anti-Soviet communist Yugoslavia, though the possibility fell out of favor after Kennedy was assassinated. The events of 1962 and the Cuban Missile Crisis itself were a back and forth of states silently talking past each other. Both the Soviet Union and the United States had fundamental assumptions about the other's intentions. The Americans were sure that the Soviets were looking for an opportunity to enslave other nations and that the United States was the only defense of the free world. The Soviets, on the other hand, believed that the United States wanted to isolate communist nations and pick them off with covert actions and military force, while the Soviets were there to defend the gains of revolution. In practical terms, the takeaway for students of intelligence and decision-making is to always second-guess, to always try and see the field of play from all angles, and to rapidly shift one's frame of reference to form a more holistic understanding of the world as it actually is. Biased analysis leads to biased results. Human beings do not always operate according to fixed theories, so even the clearest signals they send may not be so obvious. Such was the case of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The United States and the Soviet Union were on opposite sides of the world, operating under systems radically foreign to one another, and yet they could only really see the world one way, and naively expected the other to fit into their own Cold War dramas. Thank you.
All right, well, we have now had 2 great papers talking about some of the actual history of the actions taken by the CIA during the Cold War. Our third and final paper is going to give us some insight into the way CIA activity was portrayed in the media over time. So I'm really excited to introduce to you Saralena Bergsma, who will close out this panel with the topic, the Central Intelligence Agency and Illegal Hollywood Propaganda. Let's do a quick
Can you push the HDMI cord all the way in? Because
Oh, it's out, okay. That's why it's not up. It's like,
while we're eating, you may notice that.
Gotta turn it back on, sorry.
Let me see everybody in the library. Ooh.
This is how it was supposed to be from the beginning. You will see Saralena's biography on the side monitors and her PowerPoint behind her.
Awesome.
Okie dokie. Well, good morning, everyone. I'd like to start with a little story for you all. At the 2013 Oscars, something strange happened. 9 films were nominated for Best Picture that year, and 2 of them shared a coincidental link. They were both about CIA stories. Nominee film Zero Dark 30 was about the CIA-led raid that killed Osama bin Laden. Winning film Argo was about a CIA-led operation that extracted American hostages from 1970s Iraq. Both of these movies happen to share another link. They both profited greatly from CIA assistance during their filming. While the idea that the CIA has infiltrated Hollywood may sound far-fetched and sort of like a conspiracy theory at first glance, the idea has long historical roots, and CIA involvement in Hollywood has gone through several different phases over the past century. These different phases have had different goals, different motivations on the part of the CIA, but their manipulation has remained constant. And the tactics that they used are not just immoral, but also illegal. The CIA's predecessor organization was the Office of Strategic Services, or the OSS. Operating during World War II, the OSS had several different divisions, one of which was wholly devoted to producing propaganda, indicating the importance that the OSS placed on it. A declassified memo from the agency from 1943, aptly titled "The Motion Picture as a Weapon of Psychological Warfare," explained that the OSS thought propaganda films could be used to manipulate audiences, both foreign and domestic. This manipulation could cover a wide range of topics, including foreign perception of the U.S. and domestic attitudes. The memo goes on to explain the strength of the movie as a tool, stressing its importance and the great possibility it has as a psychological weapon. The OSS memo reveals a deep and pervasive view of movies, not as something to entertain, but as something to manipulate. The OSS got to put their ideas into practice with the 3 films you see here: OSS, Cloak and Dagger, and 13 Rue Madeline, all of which sought to influence domestic attitudes by normalizing the use of amoral agents in intelligence operations. All 3 productions enjoyed extensive consultations from former OSS director William Donovan, as well as former OSS members. Following the OSS's dissolvement in 1945, the CIA was founded 2 years later, in 1947. From its founding until about the mid-1960s, the CIA enjoyed a period of anonymity in Hollywood. The agency refused cooperation with Hollywood and even threatened legal action if movies so much as named the agency in their films. This period happened to coincide with a golden age of espionage for the CIA, as they were conducting coups and covert operations around the globe. Lack of CIA depictions in Hollywood at this time was incredibly intentional. It helped the agency hide in the shadows, hiding their immoral and illegal operations from the American people. While no explicit mention of the agency exists from this period, it didn't stop the CIA from meddling in Hollywood. Notably, the 2 films seen here, Animal Farm and 1984, suffered from extensive CIA interference that twisted the original Orwell novels they were based on. Orwell's novels were originally intended to push back against authoritarianism. They were meant to go against any sort of government that overstepped on its powers. But the CIA gave financial assistance to these films and twisted their messages to be solely anti-communist propaganda, stoking Cold War fears of the time. The movies pressed the idea that the communist system was evil and normalized the idea that it needed to be overthrown with violent revolution. Following a 1964 court ruling that saw the liberalization of defamation laws, media depictions began openly naming the CIA and openly showing its operations. Beginning as a period of campy and satirical films like Dr. Strangelove and The Man from U.N.C.L.E., as more information about the CIA and its operations came to light, depictions turned negative, and movies quickly followed suit. The first film to ever receive official CIA assistance was the 1973 film seen here, entitled Scorpio. The CIA offered it the ability to film on-site at Langley headquarters and offered consultations for the film and crew. The CIA skipped one crucial step, though. They never inspected Scorpio's screenplay. So imagine their surprise when the film aired a couple months later and it overwhelmingly depicted the CIA in a negative light, even featuring amoral CIA operatives killing their own agents. The film caught the CIA completely off guard, and it helped sour already turning public opinion further against the CIA. Other films from this period, such as The Spook Who Sat by the Door and 3 Days of the Condor, helped solidify these ideas that would prevail for the following decades. That the CIA was full of killers, that it was full of rogues, that it was crooked from the top to the bottom. Following decades of bad press, the CIA tried to do damage control. In 1996, it formed its Entertainment Liaison Office under Chase Brandon. In contrast with the past, this new area is marked with open and direct cooperation with Hollywood. And the CIA was sure to never repeat the same mistakes of Scorpio. Every screenplay that receives official assistance is thoroughly inspected before it can get the green light. Movies such as The Sum of All Fears and The Recruit, and TV shows such as 24, pictured here, enjoyed extensive assistance from the CIA in the form of consultations, access to CIA information, and filming access at Langley. Under Brandon and his successor Paul Berry, public perception began to shift once more. In a post-9/11 world, the CIA fought in its media to be viewed as competent, and their Hollywood work greatly paid off. Americans began to view the CIA as a sleek, collective agency with overbearing powers that were meant to scare away enemies and reassure domestic citizens. The film Zero Dark 30 from 2011 perfectly exemplifies the CIA's meddling. The film received preferential treatment over other projects about the bin Laden raid and enjoyed consultations with several former government officials, including former Undersecretary of Defense, the Chief Counterterrorism Advisor, the former Deputy National Security, the former Deputy CIA Director, and even the translator from the bin Laden raid itself. The film's producer, Mark Bull, was granted access to a classified CIA ceremony honoring members of the bin Laden raid, whose identities have yet to be made public. The film itself normalized the use of torture on prisoners, despite the fact that we know torture didn't lead to any significant information gains concerning the bin Laden raid. It promoted the idea of the CIA as being full of good, intelligent Americans that were simply being held back by the bureaucracy going on around them. This overreaching from the CIA even prompted an internal investigation, and in a declassified memo from 2013, it was concluded that not only had the CIA been interfering in movies and their screenplays, taking out scenes that they didn't like or that portrayed the CIA in a negative light, but that records of such interference were so poor that proper conclusions could never be drawn. The records were kept so poorly that the extent of their interference over the decades can never be known, even today. And this problem isn't a small one. The spy entertainment industry is incredibly lucrative. Spy movies sell hundreds of millions of tickets every year, and since 2008, the combined revenue of spy entertainment movies has grossed $1 billion. And those numbers exclude other spy-based entertainment. It's not mentioning spy-based novels, spy-based television, or spy-based video games. These CIA-sponsored films are being seen by an extraordinary amount of people, and they're giving them a dishonest representation of the CIA and its capabilities. People become frightened of its agency's prowess without proper cause. The CIA often loves to exaggerate its technological capabilities or its general competence. People receive unrealistic expectations of what intelligence can do, and this can provoke fears of dismay or shock when agencies are unable to act as the omnipotent gods they're portrayed to be in the media. And because of the poor record keeping, the true extent of this interference will never be known, which means accountability is impossible. Not only is the CIA's meddling immoral, though, it's also illegal. Discriminatory assistance from the government is illegal under the First Amendment, according to prior legal precedent, including a 1995 Supreme Court case. A 2004 law also prohibits the use of funds for publicity or propaganda use within the U.S. government. While the CIA's interference doesn't take your normal picture of propaganda, they aren't putting up posters around the city, it is still propaganda. It's a manipulation of the American psyche, trying to normalize ideas and whatever else the CIA wants. And that manipulation is a direct violation of American law. So, the next time the latest action drama about a story that seems too incredible to believe and happens to feature a CIA agent as its protagonist hits theaters, one question should arise in your mind. What does the CIA want me to take away from this film? Is this movie attempting to normalize the use of amoral agents in operations? Is it endorsing and positively portraying violent counter-revolutions against the undesirable ideology of the day? Is it endorsing and positively portraying torture? Is it making it seem necessary? Does the film try to pretend its CIA protagonist is an upstanding part of a greater machine that's ultimately working for the good of you and the rest of us? Gone are the days of CIA removal from Hollywood. The CIA thoroughly inspects every script that passes through its fingers before it can receive the stamp of approval. And in order to better engage and better call out this illegal activity, it must first be noticed for what it is: manipulation, propaganda, the use of entertainment for political gains. So remember these warning signs the next time you sit down with Jason Bourne or the next Oscar-nominated film. and don't allow their tactics to go unnoticed any longer. The CIA cannot be allowed to hide in the protection of the shadows anymore.
All right. Well, thank you, you three. Those were three amazing papers. We've got 10 minutes now for audience discussion. I see our lovely.
Eventually I will find the button.
Okay. So what I'll do is if you guys have questions for any of our three panelists, please raise your hand, and then Dr. Lipschitz will come and hand you this microphone so we can get it on.
Okay. For Saralena in particular, do you think the CIA's interference in movies, other media, has backfired on them, especially in present day, such as when they're not able to live up to the standards they may have put in the minds of the audience?
That's a very good question. I would say probably in some rare cases, but I think overwhelmingly it's worked in the CIA's favor. In a lot of modern depictions, the CIA kind of tries to do a bit of good and bad to make it a more realistic expectation. So it lets shows, portray some of the failures or some of the bad decisions that CIA operatives may make, while ultimately still saying the agency is good and competent at the end of the day. So I think the more nuanced picture that they strive for nowadays kind of helps mitigate that problem.
Hi, I'm David Schuster. I'm with the department, and I want to thank three of you for giving these papers. They were terrific to hear. And one of the things that really inspired me about the papers are how you were trying to tell the history of secrets. And how do you do that? I mean, if the documents are out there, then it's no longer a secret. So I'm curious, in your own ways, what did you find to be the biggest challenges when trying to do the investigations into these secrets?
Well, for me personally, I was trying to kind of represent the change in mindset of people who don't really talk about what they do, and trying to demonstrate that they got cocky, essentially. So it was really hard to get any sort of very on-the-nose indication of that through what people were talking about. So it had to be, I had to try and find and extrapolate from the actions that these people were taking and try and infer what that meant about their mindsets. So there was kind of a gap of information I could directly tie back to indications of overconfidence from the actors. It had to be through their actions, and that was particularly kind of difficult for me.
I'd say one of the largest things for me was finding copies of the documents. I'd find constant web pages that would be like, this memo says this, and these emails say this, and they've been released, and then I wouldn't be able to find them anywhere. And so for me, a lot of it was finding stuff that had been declassified and stuff that had been put mostly on the internet, since I can't go to archives and stuff, mostly stuff that had actually been made widely available to the public.
I had a similar problem, but in addition to a language barrier. Obviously, Russia and China are still under authoritarian regimes. I don't speak either of their languages, and even if I did, many of their archives have been resealed. I had to take it out of the paper by walk through some of in the 90s, right after the Soviet Union collapsed. There was an opening, and many of the sources I relied on were American, partnering with Russian researchers to go in and find and translate some of those documents, but it's hard to get those primary source documents still.
I just had a question on the CIA. Do you think today, with all the media out there and so much fake news, do you think the CIA is taking advantage of any of that situation to sway public opinion?
Oh, absolutely. Wherever there's division or doubt about news or media, the CIA will be there, and they'll be sure to take advantage of any kind of mess that they can spin in their favor. So I think they have definitely used this time period to get involved with media again, kind of get their fingers back in the pie and start trying to push people back into this positive light of the CIA that I think has fallen out of favor in the past recent years.
And briefly as well, one of the specific propaganda techniques in Iran that I wasn't able to talk about is they wrote fake autobiographies of some prominent Iranian socialists so in that way, they were participating in creating fake news or fake information. So I am more than certain that it is still going on in some capacity.
I have a question for Saralena. I found it very interesting because I also love history and Hollywood movies. And one thing I was wondering when you mentioned 3 Days of the Condor, that's one of my all-time favorite films that really kind of pushed back and really shed a light on what was really taking place. Would you happen to know, or in your research, did you find any modern films that are really kind of taking a really stark look at the CIA and their activities? Did you see any more modern films?
I did not come across any like post-2010 films that I know of, mostly because scholarship on the subject usually stops around the 2010 mark just because they're so recent, so memos and emails haven't been declassified or obtained under Freedom of Information Acts. So scholarship is pretty scarce on more modern media films. And also, I'd like to kind of reiterate that point that the CIA inspects everything it gets. So if the film takes an overwhelmingly negative stance towards it, it's not going to offer its assistance. And usually the films don't do as well as films that do receive that CIA assistance.
Is 2010 when the Bourne trilogy came out?
I think that's around the time when it started. I've never seen a Jason Bourne film.
Okay, so I don't know if you've seen the Jason Bourne movies, but those ones certainly take a critical eye to the CIA as well.
My question, I think it applies more for you, Logan, but panel can feel free. One thing I've noticed, one common thread that the CIA was using that you make mention of is anti-communist propaganda. Now, as we're seeing, I notice a thread is that they use a boogeyman to achieve political ends as a justification. Gorbachev, you're going to have to forgive me, history majors, I'm going to misquote this, but I believe Gorbachev said, "I did the worst thing I could do to you. I took away your bad guy." I know I butchered that, but you get the point. And what happened is, communism, and then it was terror, so it became a war on terror. It became an abstraction, which made it even better. But obviously the appetite for that kind of propaganda has lessened. So now my concern is maybe January 6th, and we're looking at domestic terrorism as possibly that next frontier. And I mean, you can see it, like an example would be the expansion of the Capitol Police, which makes sense, but when we look at the vast powers that have been allocated to Capitol Police since the January 6th, it seems like a good excuse, again, for the CIA to take political action, and this time could be something akin to, the Patriot Act. Do you think that that's also a byproduct of the earlier coups that you make mention of?
It certainly could be an outgrowth of that. My research was pretty much ended right around 1961-ish. So between then and modern times that I've experienced, I can't really say with a lot of confidence the development between those two things. But they do share quite a bit of similarities. We do see kind of abstract boogeymen being presented as something to be afraid of a lot in modern media and rhetoric from some politicians. There's a lot of claims of like Marxists and anarchists in movements like Black Lives Matter, or just in the protests, the summer of 2020, that I remember being pushed. So it's kind of that same idea of claims that aren't really substantiated, or the substantiation for it varies quite a bit, being used to justify fears of things like communism used to be, like terror was and isn't quite as much anymore. So can I draw it specifically to an outgrowth of CIA propaganda? I can't really say for certain. It shares a lot of common ground, and certainly could be, but I don't have the knowledge to say if it is a specific outgrowth of that or not.
All right, let's take one final question so we can stay on schedule. Thanks, Zach.
what do you think is the next way that the CIA is going to try to influence media? Do you think in the age of meme pages, do you think they're going to make one, or do you think they're going to try to influence the next Hitman game and try to bring people onto their side through that? What do you think is the next line?
Yeah, I think in this new modern age, social media is definitely kind of the next frontier for propaganda uses. They've extensively meddled in movies, they've extensively meddled in television shows, mostly in the 21st century. They haven't really touched video games, but I think the social media avenue is a lot farther reaching than video games could be. So I think social media is definitely where they're going to turn next. And as for the target of their propaganda, that I can't say. It depends on how the shifting international landscape plays out over the next couple of weeks, especially with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I think we could see a return to a Russian boogeyman that we saw during the communist era, but you can't say for certain.
Great. Well, please join me in thanking these three panelists for an excellent